So we arrived at this beaver lodge, and we had gone to a few beaver lodges before and seen that Wolverines has unsuccessfully been able to get into them because they're also pretty dense. But this one had gotten in.
Welcome back to the Voices of Greater Yellowstone podcast, where we share the stories and science of the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. I'm your host, Kristen Oxford, and I am so excited to share this episode with you today. A question we commonly ask fans of the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem is, if you could see one animal out in the wild, what would it be? It may surprise you that the most popular answer by far is the wolverine. So why are wolverines at the top of so many people's wildlife bucket lists? These elusive critters are rarely seen and even more rarely captured on camera. Their near-mythological status, incredible journeys over isolated, jagged peaks, and wild fierceness in a furry, compact body makes the wolverine definitely one of the coolest species in the ecosystem, if not the world. Wolverines also made headlines in late 2023 when they were listed for protections under the Endangered Species Act, an important step in securing their long-term future in the lower 48. We are so excited to have our own wolverine expert on staff join us and share her knowledge and experience working with these wondrous creatures. Blakely Atkins, who you may remember from episode 6, is the Volcano Foundation Wildlife Conservation Associate here at the Greater Yellowstone Coalition. She spent many a season in frigid temperatures conducting research on wolverines in both the United States and Canada. Blakely is also one of the few people who can tell you what a wolverine both sounds like and smells like. And pro tip, if you ever find yourself trying to track down one of these secretive animals, don't bring a peanut butter sandwich for lunch. Listen in and you'll learn why. Okay, let's learn more in Wild Wolverines with Blakely Atkins.
All right, I am Blakely Atkins. I'm the Greater Yellowstone Coalition Volcano Foundation Wildlife Conservation Associate.
That's quite the mouthful.
It is.
Well, Blakely, welcome back. Longtime listeners might recognize you and your voice from episode 6, Elk in Paradise. What have you been up to since we last chatted?
Oh boy, it's been a while. I'm still working on grizzly bear conflict prevention efforts in and around Bozeman, Gardner, Centennial Valley, Tom Minor Basin, as well as wildlife crossing implementation efforts in the Paradise Valley and part of a statewide group called Montanans for Safe Wildlife Passage.
Awesome, which is all really interesting, dynamic, and important work, but it's not why we brought you back to the podcast today. Today, we're excited to bring you back to talk about wolverines in the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. So folks listening might remember or know that in late 2023, it was announced that wolverines in the lower 48 of the United States would be added to the Endangered Species Act. And so they're going to receive protections at a federal level. So we've actually just been hearing from a lot of folks for whom wolverines are top of mind at the moment who want to know more about these fascinating and fierce guys. So you are somebody who has quite a bit of experience with wolverines. So just to start off, how would you describe a wolverine to someone who maybe has never heard of one, or for whom, they've just started hearing about them because of this new ESA designation? What's a wolverine?
All right. So you're going to have to rein me in because I could talk about wolverines all day. But wolverines are the largest member of the mustelid or the weasel family. Sorry, the largest terrestrial member. And so that includes species like mink, marten, river otter. They have a circumpolar range worldwide. So they exist in North America and Canada and the northern part of the lower 48, Alaska, Russia, China, Mongolia, which is pretty cool, Poland, Estonia, Lithuania, and Scandinavia as well.
Awesome.
Yeah. And they exist in really low densities. So another reason a lot of people haven't seen a wolverine is because they naturally exist in isolated populations. And they need persistent snowpack into the spring in order to den successfully, which is another reason why you don't see them all over the place. And they're literally built for the snow. So they're really low to the ground. They have really large, kind of snowshoe-looking feet, really small ears, and fur that is so thick that they don't feel the cold unless it's negative 40 degrees.
Wow.
And they're just tenacious little critters.
That's amazing. Yeah. Why do they have this reputation for being so fierce?
I mean, first of all, I think it's because they exist in these really cold climates, in the boreal forest, for example, and they thrive there. So they thrive, way up on the mountaintops and in these places that us as humans don't really tend to go. They also feed predominantly on carrion, and so you see them going after things much larger than them. So they weigh about up to 30 pounds for a male. And so you'll see them feeding on things like moose. There's been evidence of them eating grizzly bears, probably not taking down a grizzly bear, but seeing grizzly bear DNA in their scat.
Wow.
The noises they make also give them that reputation. But again, I mean, mind you, they're only 30 pounds max. So they stand their ground. They go after these large critters. They exist in these freezing temperatures. But in the end, I kind of think of them as something like a grizzly bear. They stand their ground, but inside they're probably fearful of us.
Small but mighty. I like
Yeah.
it. So we're recording today from the Greater Yellowstone Coalition's office in Bozeman, Montana, and we're experiencing a bit of a cold snap right now. So it was negative 20 outside this morning. So that would not faze a wolverine.
No, and they really do thrive in that cold weather. So they're built in a way that they can move across the snow, and where a lot of critters like ungulates will get stuck in the snow and not be able to move across it very fast. There's a recent video of a wolverine traveling across the snow in Cook City, I believe, that a skier took. And the thing is just, I don't know how fast it's going, but it's going remarkably fast,
Just
right across the snow.
not phased at all.
Yeah, there's photos of them going up avalanche chutes in places like Glacier National Park.
Amazing. So Blakely, how did you first get involved with wolverines, and what's your experience like from working with them?
Yeah, so I worked on various wolverine research projects for 7 different winters. And so 4 winters, I was working in central Idaho on a recreation study where we were tracking recreationists, mostly snowmobilers, as well as collaring and tracking wolverines. And so the purpose of that was to see if recreation was impacting their denning success. And yeah, we collared a good amount of wolverines in places like Island Park, Stanley, Ketchum, Driggs, so some places in the GYE. And then for one winter, I also collared wolverines in northwest Alberta, and that was in a real remote spot called Rainbow Lake. And we were looking at wolverines and how they interact with gas and oil industry. So collaring them and then also backtracking them. So looking at where from their collar data there was clusters of data points, and then walking into those points and seeing what was going on there, whether there was a den there, whether they were caching food there, basically why they were hanging out there. And then a different winter studied wolverines in northwest Ontario. There we were pretty much just seeing generally what they were up to and how many there were. And then back in Idaho, did an occurrence study, which also happened here in Montana in, I think it was 2017. And so in Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, and Washington, they hired people to just put up cameras and scent stations and gun brushes to collect DNA and just to see if wolverines were occurring at these random data points.
Okay. Is a scent station what it sounds like? Is that just like a scent-based attractant to try to get wolverines into an area?
Yeah, so you put up a big chunk of meat, or we put up sponges that were soaked in beaver castor and catnip as well to see if lynx came in.
Interesting.
And then basically just saw what showed up on the cameras.
Okay.
So,
Fascinating.
yeah.
So most people have never seen and will never see a wolverine in the wild, but you are not one of them. Do you have any particularly memorable moments from interactions with or experiences with wolverines out in the field?
Gosh, yeah. I have a long list of them, but I have seen quite a few wolverines simply because we were sedating them and putting collars on them. So I've handled them, which is really cool. I mean, I know what they smell like. I've, stuck a thermometer up a wolverine's butt, which
Fun.
a lot of people can't say they've done that.
Hope that's right on your resume.
Top of the list, yeah. But I have never just ran into a wolverine. So part of me thinks that may never happen for me simply because I've studied them and put collars on them and poked and prodded at them. But
You're a known entity in wolverine circles.
yeah, but I hope it happens one day. So yeah, lots of stories. Probably one of the coolest experiences I had doing research was in Northwest Alberta, and we were backtracking some cluster data, and it led us to a beaver lodge. So beavers are like a high commodity item, food item for wolverines. They're got a ton of fat on them, little compact critters full of fat. So we arrived at this beaver lodge, and we had gone to a few beaver lodges before and seen that wolverines has unsuccessfully been able to get into them because, yeah, they're also pretty dense. But this one had gotten in, and there was just this murder scene of beavers. So this wolverine, maybe multiple wolverines, had pretty much, I'm assuming, killed all the beavers in this lodge. So you could see where it had crawled in and maybe was just waiting in there for the beavers to come back to the lodge. And there was beavers' parts cached all around the lodge.
Oh, no.
So it was a gruesome scene, but also fascinating. I mean, I had never visited a beaver lodge and tried to actually see what was in there. I mean, all you usually see is just this huge, massive pile of sticks. And so for a wolverine to actually get into it is pretty remarkable.
That sounds horrifying. But fascinating.
Yeah, fascinating. And so wolverines will cache what they find. So obviously they're not going to eat the entire moose or beaver family that they find. And so they'll cache food so that it stays cold throughout the winter and they can come back and have plenty to eat.
Okay, I'm starting to get a much clearer picture of why they have this reputation for a specific kind of badassery.
Yeah.
So you're out doing wolverine research in some fantastically remote places, seeing, again, things most people never will. Can you describe for us sort of like what was your life like during those winters? Like, where did you live? How did you move across the landscape? Like what was it actually like to be out there in these fantastically wild places doing this research?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly miss it. I miss it a lot. Very remote, somewhat lonely, but you get really close with the people you're working with. Not only because there's no one else to hang out with, but I mean, you're putting your life in other people's hands when you're working in places like that. Whether you're snowmobiling across frozen lakes and rivers, or you're just especially far back in the wilderness in the dead of winter in places like Stanley, Idaho, that are colder than most places in the rest of the country every year. So yeah, I mean, I'm still, some of those people that I worked with doing wolverine work are my closest friends. They'll be lifelong friends. So that, and then also, I mean, yeah, you're in places where I remember one day my Leatherman literally snapped in half.
No way.
It was 40 below, and we were tinkering around with a camera, and, you know, a lot of the time you have to take your gloves off because you're, you know, having to put screws in or, you know, have a syringe of ketamine you're messing around with trying to sedate a wolverine. And gloves get in the way. So, yeah, Leatherman's break in half. I guess I should say, you know, so to trap a wolverine, you have what looks like a small miniature log cabin that you build on site with lodgepole pine, pretty much. And then you bait it with an entire quarter of an elk, usually roadkill, and then it has a trigger on it. And so when the wolverine goes to grab that bait, it pulls on that trigger and releases a lock, and the lid drops. And then you get a text or an email saying your trap's down. And usually that would happen in the middle of the night. And so you'll be out there all night in the field. And I mean, some nights were so cold that the sap in the trees would be popping around you.
So you could hear that?
Yeah. So you just hear, yeah, it sounded like, I don't know, like a firework going off, like a small firework all around you. And it's just the sap freezing and expanding in the tree, or the xylem freezing and expanding.
I'm trying to imagine like a wolverine out on the landscape that's led this incredibly rough and tumble life, and suddenly it stumbles across like a little purpose-built log cabin with just a buffet set out. How disappointing it must be to realize that's a trap.
Yeah.
So describe for us, you know, you talked about going out at night a lot, but describe for us sort of like a typical, if there is one, day in the life of a wolverine researcher. Like, you wake up in the morning, where are you, and then what do you do?
All right, so coffee's important. Start your day with coffee. And make sure you pack a high-fat lunch and snacks, like enough snacks for days. So nuts, chocolate, bacon. Start your day with bacon, and bring bacon with you.
The ultimate survival food.
Yeah. Let's see. Sausage sticks. Nothing that freezes. Peanut butter and jelly. That's a no. That's a hard no. That freezes. It's disgusting. When we were live trapping wolverines, let's say a trap goes down, so you pack up all your field gear, and a lot of the wolverine researchers I worked with, we had extensive field gear. So we had a sleeping bag for the wolverine to put in when they were sedated to keep them warm, with water bottles. So lots of field gear. So that's if you have a wolverine in the trap. So a crew goes out, 2 people go out on snowmobiles or skis, checks to see what's in the trap. If it's a wolverine, all that gear comes out with at least 2 more people. And you could be in the field, for hours, basically the whole day, just in order to put a collar on a wolverine or take a collar off of a wolverine. So we would only keep the collars on for the winter. So just making sure you have lots of food, extra coffee, basically prepare yourself to stay out there overnight if need be.
Burr. What are some of the things that you have found in traps that weren't wolverines?
Oh man, lots of fox, lots of marten. In Canada, in Ontario, I had a few wolves.
No way.
That were in traps, and that was exciting.
I bet.
Yeah, that was a surprise. And it's hard to tell what's in the trap, so you kind of crack it and then shine a light in there. And I just remember being face to face with something that I wasn't sure what it was. and opened it a little further and was like, oh my God, that's a wolf.
That's a wolf. We're letting you go now.
Yeah, lynx.
Mm-hmm.
Lynx are incredibly intimidating because a wolverine will charge you. So usually you can knock the trap and you can hear them, and they have this really guttural growl.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, okay, that's wolverine. We'll prepare for that. And lynx sometimes growl, but when you open the trap, they just stare at you. And they like stare into you. Whereas a wolverine, you're like, okay, it's going to charge me and growl. And
A lynx is silently cursing you and your family for generations.
exactly.
Yeah, that kind of sounds about right. So, we have wolverines here in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Where in this ecosystem do they live? And why, again, is it so hard to see one?
Yeah, so they're in all 3 states of the GYE, but they exist in areas with that persistent snowpack into the spring. So, you could say, yeah, they're in Yellowstone National Park, but they're not necessarily scampering around everywhere in Yellowstone National Park. They're in areas and have ranges that have that, high elevation snow. But with that said, I mean, you do have young individuals that are looking to create their own range. And so you have them that popping up in places that you wouldn't necessarily expect, like Butte, like the streets of Butte. So a lot of people think, oh, they're this nomadic creature, they're everywhere. And in reality, although they have especially large home ranges, so males have home ranges up to 500 square miles in the lower 48, you have these ones that are searching to create their home range. And yeah, it could end up in Tahoe or Colorado or coastal Washington.
Yeah, the home range thing is interesting because I think one of the things that is not often covered with wolverines is sort of their social dynamics. We think of them as incredibly isolated. So what is their social life like? Like, do they have friends or lovers or enemies? How do they interact with each other?
Let's say all of the above to make it interesting. But yeah, wolverines are really unique in terms of their social structure. So one male range will encompass multiple female ranges. And so then that male and the females within the range kind of have this unique connection. So the male will check in on all the females and and mate with all of those females within the range. And the females actually choose. They're the ones that decide, yeah, I want to be in that male's range.
Interesting.
Yeah, so they kind of have the upper hand. So the females within that male's range, they'll only associate with that one male. And in return, that male will help with paternal care and also, protect resources, food resources for himself and all of the females and the kids.
Wow.
So they have this really cool, unique social structure that you don't see in, I think a similar social structure was seen in the stone marten, I believe in Scandinavia, but pretty much nowhere else. So yeah, the kits are born in the female den, and then they leave the den, and the female has these sites called rendezvous sites. So she'll kind of leave the kits, go off, find food, bring food back. And then one day she's like, you know what, you're on your own, kits. And then the kits, because they have already met their father, because he's been checking in on them, they're like, we're going to go find Dad. And then the male teaches the kits how to hunt and how to find food. And then eventually, usually the females stick close to, where they were born, even if it's within that same range or neighboring range. And then the young males are more likely to kind of travel further distances to find their own. And then when that male gets old and, isn't as physically fit, a young male like will pop in and be like, ooh, that male's getting kind of feeble, and introduce himself to the females so that they kind of get a sense for who he is, and then he'll eventually take over.
That is fascinating. So the parents have like sequential custody of the kids, kind of, and then oh man, that is so interesting. I've never heard anything like that.
Yeah, my friend Jeff Copeland, he's a Wolverine biologist, and he's like fascinated by this social structure, and yeah, it's really unique.
I feel like you've already answered what my next question was going to be for you then, which is what are some, really interesting facts about Wolverines that people might not know? I'm getting a sense there might be lots of these. So do you have any others to share with us?
I do. I have quite a few. Yeah. Let's see where to start. So the kits are white when they're born. So if you Google Wolverine kits, they're like bright white. And I met this guy, I don't know, I'm just going to assume this is accurate, but he has captive Wolverines. I don't know if he's still around, but he at least had captive Wolverines, a bunch of them in Washington. And he was saying he put a camera out in like a makeshift Wolverine den. And so he saw the kits when they were born, and he said that they have a different smell to them. And he was thinking maybe it's to deter predators.
Like they smell bad?
I mean, like a Wolverine doesn't smell great. They smell really musky. But he was saying that the kits have a different smell to them.
Okay.
And he was thinking perhaps that's because, a predator might not associate the kit with a Wolverine. They might not recognize that smell.
Okay. So maybe they smell like spinach or something. Or like
something like that.
Nothing to see here.
Yeah. And then Wolverine dens are pretty cool. So there's kind of the main part of the den, and then there's tunnels that connect to things like latrines. And so, yeah, there's like the main den and then smaller dens and other, functioning spaces for, coming off of that main den. So pretty cool. An interesting study in Scandinavia showed that reproductive success of those Wolverines was tied to rodent populations. So
like the healthier the rodent population was, presumably the more nutrients maybe the mother and father Wolverine are getting, and they have better reproductive success, or they're bringing that food back to the kits, just more availability.
Yeah, just that's their primary source of food.
Okay.
Yeah. And
cool.
then, throughout Wolverines across the world, I mean, they have different primary sources of food. So I think in British Columbia, their main source of food is like ground squirrels or marmots. And then in parts of Canada, it's moose. And I think in the GYE, it's elk.
Okay.
Yeah.
Amazing. So just any meat source seems like fair game.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, that is all so interesting. I am learning so much I did not know about Wolverines today. Well, like I mentioned earlier in the podcast, we've seen quite a few headlines about these critters recently because Wolverines in the lower 48 are going to be listed under the Endangered Species Act, which is often abbreviated to ESA. So to start off with, could you just tell us what is the Endangered Species Act and why animals might be listed or delisted on it?
So the Endangered Species Act came about in 1973, and it was put in place in order to protect wildlife, fish, and plants, and classify those protections under either threatened or endangered. And then from there, plans for federal management are enacted, and that leads to a road to recovery. Like a road to recovery is mapped out from there, and in order to hopefully delist the population.
Okay, so it's sort of like this emergency designation, if you will, of protections that can then maybe help a population rebound. if it's not doing well?
Yeah, so if numbers get especially low, if habitat is at risk, these protections can get put in place in order to hopefully recover that population.
Got it. So what were some of the factors that led to wolverines being listed under the Endangered Species Act late last year?
So wolverines in the contiguous U.S. received federal protections as a threatened species at the end of November of 2023. And attempts to list wolverines in the past have been made for over 10 years. So those attempts were delayed or rejected, they were denied mainly because of a lack of data. So since 2013 was the first time that they were attempted to be listed. And since then, there's a lot more available data through research like the research I've participated in. A lot more information on climate change, a lot more information on habitat connectivity, snowpack specifics, population densities, genetics, and so on. And so that's all led to, up until now, where they've said, okay, yeah, there is substantial data, and it is clear that climate change is impacting wolverines simply due to that persistent snowpack. So there's a lot less of that. Also, I mean, you look at recreation, and in places where wolverines exist, people haven't in the past been able to access those places. And now you have things like, high-tech snow machines, way more backcountry skiers than we've ever seen, snow bikes, and so people can access wolverine habitat much easier.
Yeah, interesting. It strikes me as remarkable, that we need all this data to inform management decisions for animals like wolverines, but they're so hard to study that like the way that they move across the landscape or their own sort of resilience in some ways could be like inhibiting our ability to know how to best manage them, which feels like a particularly interesting and unique challenge for a species like that.
Yeah. I mean, the lack of data is an issue, but yeah, like you're saying, gathering that data is especially hard. There was a winter where we had a crew based out of Driggs and looking for wolverines outside of Driggs and then up into Jackson and the Tetons, and also a crew in Island Park. And between both those crews, we only collared 3 wolverines in an entire winter. So even though that data is important, it may not be enough data to prove a case. So it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of money, a lot of coffee.
A lot of coffee, a lot of bacon.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Blakely. We do have some listener questions for you. Listener Dan from Idaho actually had quite a few great questions for you, so we're going to ask all of them. For starters, Dan observes that although present, it seems like wolverines are extremely rare in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Are there habitat limitations that are preventing a more robust population?
Yeah, again, it's that snowpack, and combined with their large range, it really does create these natural isolated populations that they exist in. For example, in Glacier National Park, it has been researched, wolverines have been researched in there for a long time, and it's thought to have the highest density of wolverines in the world. And even though that's the case, there's likely only 40 that exist there. And that's a lot for a wolverine. So when we say that, I think it's been said that there's 300 that exist in the lower 48.
So Dan further wonders if the GYE population might benefit from translocating some animals from Canada or Alaska to Greater Yellowstone.
I don't know if I have the answer to that. I think wolverines have only been relocated once in Finland. And aside from that, people haven't attempted that, as far as I know. And again, you would only want to attempt that. I mean, they're so territorial as well that who knows if that wolverine would even be successful if you just took it from Alaska and dumped it off in Yellowstone. Or if Yellowstone is maybe at its capacity for wolverines, maybe they would have to go elsewhere and make a home range elsewhere. It's a good question.
Yeah. So it sounds like despite the fact that they are sort of so sparsely populated, that might be just how wolverines are. So we don't really know if, more density would be like a healthy thing or not.
Yeah. I think instead of spending the time and energy and effort translocating wolverines, it's better to just, resolve climate change.
Okay. Yeah. That's
Really easy.
easier.
Yeah. Yeah, so although we've seen success with relocation when it comes to species like wolves, that's not necessarily the solution for a critter like a wolverine.
Got it. Yeah, that's interesting. You already answered what was going to be Dan's third question, which was, has a wolverine relocation ever been attempted anywhere? And it sounds like Finland, they did make an attempt at that. So
I did. I reached out to my friend Jeff Copeland and asked him because I was curious as well. So good question, Dan.
Love it. Okay, final listener question for you, Blakely. Sally from Montana wants to know if you have a particularly memorable experience of wolverine fierceness that you've witnessed from your time in the field.
Yeah, I guess this would be more of an example of determination. But there was one day, and I was already out in the field with a coworker, and we called back on the satellite phone just to check in and say we're coming home. And our boss was like, a trap just went down right by where you are. Can you go and check on it and see what's in it? And we knew that there was a female that was collared in the area who was likely going to have kits or had kits. And so we were like, yeah, and went straight there. And it probably took us half an hour to get there, which is no time at all. And that wolverine had chewed her way all the way out of the trap and gotten out within that 30 minutes.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, Sally, there you have it. Sounds like they are remarkably capable creatures. Blakely, thank you so much. It was really fun to talk with you about wolverines. Of course, we have one final question for you. We, as you well know, like to ask all our guests who their conservation hero is, but you've already been on the podcast, so we already have that answer from you. Anyone who's curious, go listen to episode 6. So instead, we're going to wrap up with this question, which is, if you could wave a magic wand and some conservation issue would be solved, what would it be?
I've got plastics on the brain lately, so I would say getting rid of all microplastics. Yeah,
Poof.
Plastics be gone.
Well, Blakely, I love that answer, and it's been a real pleasure having you back on the podcast. So thank you, as always, for your time and for sharing a lot of your stories about wolverines with us.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
All right, stay warm.
You too.
We're so grateful Blakely was able to stop by the podcast and share her passion for these wild wolverines. If you'd like to check out some of Blakely's videos of her releasing wolverines from their log cabin traps, you can head over to our website or Instagram page via the link in the show notes. There's also a great video of a snuffling and snarling wolverine in its box. Check it out. It's definitely a sound that will make the hairs on the back of your neck stand straight up. The Voices of Greater Yellowstone is a podcast by the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, a conservation nonprofit that works with all people to protect the lands, waters, and wildlife of the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. If you'd like to support the podcast, please consider a donation to the Greater Yellowstone Coalition via the link in the show notes, or share this episode with your social circles. Our work is funded by generous supporters like you, and it helps keep the podcast free of ads and focused on telling these important stories. As always, thank you for listening to the Voices of Greater Yellowstone podcast and sharing it with your family and friends. We will see you next time.